The first thing Avery Knight understood was that her mistake had not stayed inside her phone. It had escaped into the building's bloodstream, into the quiet geometry of glass corridors and badge-locked doors, into the brief pauses between keystrokes when people sensed a shift they could not yet name. It moved faster than any rumor because it was not a rumor at all. It was a fact, delivered clean and irreversible. A single line, sent to the one person in the company whose name functioned like a boundary rather than a contact. A line that could be read as weakness, as provocation, as leverage, as danger. A line that, once it existed, could never be unsent. And the cruelest part was that Avery had not even meant it. She had spent years learning how to disappear without vanishing. In Manhattan skyscrapers, invisibility was not failure. It was survival. She dressed in neutral colors, spoke only when necessary, arrived early enough to be useful and left late enough to be overlooked. She understood the unspoken law of the building. Attention was never free. It always came with a cost. That morning, the city looked unchanged. Cold light on steel, taxis slicing through damp streets, people walking like time owned them. The lobby of Marrow and Pike rose around her in polished stone and deliberate silence, a place that demanded restraint without asking for it. Her badge flashed green. The elevator carried her upward among strangers who avoided eye contact by instinct. The open floor hummed with contained urgency. Screens glowed. Coffee machines hissed. Conversations stayed low and clipped. Everything about the space was designed to look controlled, including the people inside it. Avery's desk sat where attention rarely landed, back left, near the emergency stairwell. Not punishment, placement. She unpacked her bag with practiced efficiency and placed her one personal object on the corner of her desk. A porcelain teacup wrapped in soft cloth. White, delicate, with a faded rose and a thin crack near the rim. It did not belong here. That was why she brought it. The cup had been her mother's. From nights when sleep broke apart, when tea and honey were the only things that stayed down. Avery never spoke of that history at work. She did not trade vulnerability for belonging. But the cup came anyway, a quiet anchor against the weight of glass and steel. She heated water under her desk, stirred chamomile with honey, and let the routine steady her hands. The day ahead was heavy. A client pitch, a board packet. Tension lingered in the building like charged air. When the executive floor grew restless, everyone felt it. Her phone buzzed. A group chat notification. Abby, safe territory. Avery began typing a response while scanning her inbox, splitting her attention the way she always did. She wrote without looking closely enough, letting exhaustion loosen her guard. A short line slipped out, honest in a way she usually swallowed. She hit send. The message did not go where it was meant to. The blue checkmark appeared under the wrong name. Rowan Cross. For a moment, Avery did not move. Her finger hovered above the screen, her breath stalled. Her mind rejected what her eyes confirmed. She blinked, then blinked again. The name remained. The message remained delivered. Heat rushed to her face, then drained, leaving her skin cold. Her heart began to pound, heavy and fast. She thought of deleting the thread, of smashing the phone against the desk, of pretending this was a hallucination. But she knew better. Rowan Cross was not simply the CEO. He was the architecture of the company. Calm, distant, precise. A man who rarely appeared on the open floor and never wasted motion. He did not raise his voice. He did not soften language. He ended careers with clean efficiency. No one knew him closely. No one needed to. Avery had never spoken to him. She had seen him only through glass and distance, a controlled presence framed by authority. Dark suits, steady gaze, a face that revealed nothing and demanded everything. Now her private weakness sat in his inbox like a confession. Her mouth went dry. She set the phone down too carefully, noticing her fingers tremble. She forced herself to look at her monitor. Numbers blurred. An email notification chimed and she flinched. Laughter drifted from across the floor and felt obscene, out of place. She told herself to breathe. She told herself it was human error. But she also knew mistakes were never neutral here. They were interpreted, shaped, and used. Even silence could become a story. Minutes passed. Her phone stayed dark. That silence grew teeth. She tried to work, burying herself in spreadsheets and formatting, but her attention snapped back again and again to the phone. Her mind rehearsed consequences. HR, security, a quiet escort out, her badge going red. The teacup left behind, still warm, still waiting. She took a sip of tea. It tasted too sweet. Her stomach tightened. Then the office shifted. It happened subtly, like weather. A hush spread from the center aisle outward. Chairs stilled. Voices dropped. People straightened without knowing why. Avery felt it before she saw it. Footsteps approached. Measured, unhurried, certain. A shadow crossed her desk. Her lungs tightened. She stared at her screen 1 second too long, hopping not to be real. Then she looked up. Rowan Cross stood beside her. He was taller than she expected, not dramatically but undeniably. Dark slacks, crisp shirt, jacket over one arm. His expression was calm, unreadable. Up close, she noticed details distance had hidden. The controlled fatigue near his eyes, the precision of his stillness. He did not look angry. That was worse. The open floor behind him held its breath. Avery felt every eye sharpen with curiosity. Attention pressed against her skin like heat. His gaze flicked to her phone, face down, then back to her. Slow, exact. He did not smile. He did not soften. He simply occupied her space as if it belonged to him now. Avery swallowed. Her hands moved toward her mouse out of reflex. The click sounded too loud. Her fingers shook, he noticed. His attention was not loud, but it was intimate, clinical. It made her feel dissected without being touched, not just seen, but evaluated. She reached for her teacup instinctively. The porcelain was warm. The crack pressed under her thumb, grounding her. She held it like a lifeline. Rowan's gaze dropped to the cup. Something shifted, almost imperceptibly. Focus narrowed. A pause, as if he had found a detail he had not expected to matter. Then his eyes returned to her. Her pulse stumbled. The office behind him was silent now, listening without looking. She felt exposed, framed by his presence. In this building, proximity itself was power, and he had crossed the distance deliberately. Avery searched for words. Apology, explanation, anything. None came. Her phone vibrated softly against the desk. Her breath caught. She looked down before she could stop herself. A reply notification. She did not read it. The existence of it was enough. He had read her message. He had answered. Rowan watched her reaction with the same calm focus. Shame burned through her, sharp and bright. She wanted to disappear into the floor. He shifted his weight slightly. The change altered the air. Avery felt it like gravity recalibrating. The coffee machine had stopped. The room was fully quiet now. She tightened her grip on the cup, then forced herself to loosen it, afraid it might break. The crack suddenly felt fragile, dangerous. She imagined tea spilling, another mess to explain. She lifted her eyes again. Rowan's expression remained controlled, but his gaze held something predatory in its restraint. Not aggression, interest, the kind that measured and waited, the kind that chose. In that moment, Avery understood the true danger. Not that he could destroy her, but that he might choose not to, and that choice would cost her more. He glanced once more at the corner of her desk, at the cloth wrap, the honey jar beside her keyboard. The look was brief, private. It felt like trespass. Then he turned away. He walked back across the open floor at the same measured pace. The office did not breathe until he reached the aisle. People pretended to work again, but the rhythm was broken. Avery could feel the story forming around her. She remained still, staring at the space he had occupied. Her heart hammered. Her tea sat untouched. She turned her phone face down again, without reading the message. Reading would make it real in a way she was not ready for. The office noise rebuilt itself slowly. Chairs moved. Conversations resumed. But Avery felt marked. Attention clung to her like a scent. She looked at her cup. The crack caught the light like a thin blade. She thought of her mother using it anyway, of survival that did not require perfection. Still, her throat tightened. Rowan had noticed the cup. That unsettled her more than anything else. She forced herself to work, fingers steadying by sheer will. Numbers filled the screen. Emails went out. Her body stayed tense, waiting for another shadow. Avery understood then that her life had already changed, not because she had sent a message, but because the man she sent it to had stepped into her space, let the entire office see it, and walked away without ending it. The mistake had not burned out. It had signaled something awake. And somewhere behind executive glass, a predator had lifted its head and decided to watch. The waiting was worse than the moment itself. After Rowan Cross walked away from her desk, Avery Knight spent the rest of that day suspended in a state of controlled dread. She did not leave early. She did not check her phone more than necessary. She did not ask anyone anything. She sat straight, worked methodically, and behaved exactly as a person behaved when they expected to be erased quietly. Every email notification made her pulse spike. Every unfamiliar name in her inbox felt like the beginning of an ending. She prepared herself for the procedural coldness of HR, for the carefully worded subject line that would pretend this was routine. She imagined her access revoked, her badge blinking red, her name vanishing from shared drives as if it had never belonged there. None of that happened. Instead, the next morning arrived intact. Her badge still worked, her inbox still loaded, her calendar still existed. That was when the unease deepened. By mid-morning, a new meeting appeared on her schedule. No subject line beyond a project code. No location listed except one word, executive floor. No attendees except her name and Rowan Cross's. No assistant copied. No HR. No record of who had scheduled it. In this building, such absences were never accidental. Avery read the invite 3 times. Her body reacted before her thoughts did. A tightening in her chest. A faint ringing in her ears. She felt the familiar instinct to shrink, to minimize, to make herself as neutral as possible. She closed the calendar tab and reopened it, as if the invitation might disappear if she looked away long enough. It did not. The walk to the executive floor felt longer than it ever had before. The elevator rose smoothly, silently, carrying her past floors she rarely visited. She watched the numbers change, each one a reminder that she was moving closer to the center of power rather than away from it. Her reflection in the mirrored wall looked composed, but her eyes betrayed a vigilance she could not soften. The executive floor was quieter than the rest of the building, not because there was less work being done, but because noise was unnecessary here. The carpet muted footsteps. The walls were thicker. The glass was darker. People did not linger. They passed through spaces with purpose, as if they understood that hesitation was a weakness best avoided. Rowan's office sat at the end of the corridor, framed by tinted glass and clean lines. The door was closed. Avery stopped a few feet short of it, steadying her breath. She told herself this was work. She told herself nothing had been said, nothing had been promised, nothing had been accused. She told herself she was here because of competence, not because of a message she wished she could burn out of existence. When she entered, the room revealed itself slowly. It was large but restrained, designed less to impress than to control. A long desk faced the windows, which looked out over the city from a height that made people feel small. Everything was orderly. Papers stacked with intention, screens dark but ready, no personal clutter, no signs of softness. Rowan Cross stood near the window, reviewing something on a tablet. He did not look up immediately. That alone told Avery this was not a meeting built on equality. The hour that followed unfolded, like a performance written in subtext. On the surface, everything was professional: metrics, deadlines, risk analysis. Avery spoke when asked, precise and efficient. She did not mention the message. He did not mention it either. But the absence of it hovered between them, shaping every movement. What changed was the way Rowan watched her. It was not the casual observation of a superior checking work. It was attentive, deliberate, and unsettlingly specific. He tracked her pauses, the way her fingers moved when she thought, the slight adjustment she made to her posture when she felt uncertain. He noticed when she glanced toward the window before answering, as if grounding herself against the city beyond it. And he noticed the things no one else ever had. The time of day she drank tea, the way she always brought it with her, never used the office mugs, the honey instead of sugar, the porcelain cup that did not belong in this environment but appeared anyway, day after day, unchanged by context. He did not comment on it, but his gaze returned to it more than once, and Avery felt the awareness of that attention like a hand at the small of her back. At first, she interpreted it as surveillance. The knowledge made her skin prickle. She began to question her own routines, wondering when they had become visible, when they had turned into data points someone else could collect. The idea that the most powerful man in the company had been noticing her habits felt invasive, almost predatory. It made her want to dismantle the small rituals she relied on, to strip herself down to pure efficiency again. But the attention did not recede. Instead, it intensified. Over the following days, Rowan continued to involve her directly. Requests arrived without explanation. Meetings were scheduled without intermediaries. Her name appeared on documents she had never been included in before. None of it violated policy. None of it could be challenged openly. It was all defensible as professional necessity. Yet the pattern was unmistakable. He kept her close. In a dark romance, proximity was never neutral. It was a risk disguised as privilege. Avery felt it in the way other people began to look at her, their curiosity sharpening into something edged. Conversations quieted when she passed. Messages in Slack paused mid-thread. Someone she barely knew lingered too long near her desk, pretending to look for a printer. The office had noticed. And with notice came interpretation. Avery became careful in new ways. She monitored her expressions, her tone, her timing. She made sure she was never alone with Rowan in visible spaces. She avoided eye contact in hallways. She limited her movement, her presence, her footprint. The harder she tried to contain herself, the more attention she seemed to attract. That was when the other threat emerged. Catherine Monroe did not announce herself as an antagonist. She never raised her voice. She never displayed open hostility. She arrived like a polished inevitability, all controlled smiles and perfectly calibrated concern. As head of public relations, Catherine had spent years crafting Rowan's image into something untouchable, decisive, disciplined, incorruptible. She understood power not as force, but as narrative. Her first interaction with Avery was almost kind. A passing remark in the corridor, a gentle observation about the pressure of working close to leadership, a reminder, delivered lightly, that perception mattered as much as performance. Catherine spoke the language of protection, of reputation, of avoiding unnecessary complications. She framed her interest as guidance, as mentorship. Avery recognized the danger immediately. Catherine did not accuse, she implied. She did not threaten. She warned. She positioned Avery as a variable that needed managing, a potential stain on a carefully pressed surface. And she did it with such grace that any objection would have sounded ungrateful. Soon, the whispers took on a new shape. They were no longer about a message sent by mistake. They were about access, about favoritism, about what a woman like Avery might have done to earn the attention of a man like Rowan. None of it was said directly. It did not need to be. The office ran on inference. Avery felt herself becoming a surface onto which other people projected their assumptions. She had done nothing differently, and yet everything around her had shifted. The same quiet competence that once made her invisible now made her suspicious. The same restraint that once protected her now marked her as secretive. Rowan did nothing to stop it. He did not correct rumors. He did not issue statements. He did not shield her publicly. Instead, he continued to draw her inward, closer to the center of his attention, closer to the gravitational pull that made everything else bend. His silence was not neglect. It was strategy. By refusing to clarify, he allowed ambiguity to grow. By keeping her within his orbit, he made her indispensable in ways no one could quantify. For Avery, the effect was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. She felt the power of being seen by someone who did not need to see her. She felt the danger of being chosen by someone who could afford to discard her. Every interaction carried the weight of imbalance. Every request felt like a test she did not know how to pass. At night, she lay awake replaying moments she had not realized mattered until after they had passed. A glance held too long. A pause before he dismissed her. The way his attention sharpened when she remained silent instead of filling space with reassurance. She wondered what he saw in her. And worse, she wondered what he wanted. The porcelain cup became a focal point of that tension. It appeared in reflections, in photographs taken accidentally, in the corner of other people's awareness. It was too personal, too human, too out of place. Catherine noticed it once, her gaze lingering just long enough to register disapproval before smoothing back into neutrality. Avery considered leaving it at home. She did not. Something stubborn in her refused to surrender the one object that reminded her she existed beyond corporate narratives. The cup stayed, and with it, the crack, the softness, the proof that she had survived things far more brutal than gossip. By the end of the week, nothing catastrophic had happened. That was the most unsettling part. No firing, no reprimand, no clear escalation. Just a slow tightening of the space around her. People watched, Catherine adjusted, Rowan observed. And Avery understood that this was not a misunderstanding moving toward resolution. It was the beginning of a story forming without her consent, shaped by power, desire, and perception. A story that thrived on attention and fed on silence. She had not been punished. She had been marked. And in a world where visibility was currency and vulnerability was blood, being held in someone's attention could be both a privilege and a poison. The summons arrived without warning and without drama, which was how the most dangerous conversations in the building always began. Avery Knight received the calendar notification mid-morning, folded neatly between two routine meetings, labeled in language so neutral it felt deliberately anesthetized. A check-in, a compliance conversation. No accusations, no explanation, just a location on the 12th floor and the unmistakable signature of human resources. The kind of invitation that pretended to be about care while preparing a record. She did not panic. Panic had never helped her survive anything. She closed the calendar tab, finished the sentence she had been typing, and sent the email she had been working on. Her hands were steady, though she felt a slow pressure building behind her ribs, the familiar sensation of being cornered by a system that refused to name what it wanted from her. She had known this moment was coming. Attention always demanded payment, and the bill was never delivered openly. The walk to the HR floor felt different from her earlier trip to the executive level. Where Rowan Cross's territory had been quiet and controlled, HR was sterile in a way that stripped people of individuality. Neutral colors, frosted glass, carefully selected art that meant nothing. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and expensive coffee. Everything in the space suggested order without warmth, authority without ownership. The conference room had no windows. That detail registered immediately, the way the body always noticed confinement before the mind articulated it. The lighting was bright and flat, eliminating shadows. The table was long, its surface immaculate, designed to keep distance rather than encourage collaboration. Avery took her seat where she was indicated, placing her hands loosely together in front of her, shoulders squared, spine straight. She did not cross her arms. She did not fidget. She did not apologize with her posture. Across from her sat two HR representatives and Catherine Monroe. Catherine's presence confirmed what Avery had already understood. This was not about policy. This was about narrative. Catherine looked composed, as always, dressed in tailored restraint, her expression calibrated to suggest concern rather than control. She did not greet Avery warmly, nor coldly. She simply observed, the way someone observed a situation they believed they already understood. Avery recognized that look. It was the look of someone who had decided what story they were managing, and now needed the subject to cooperate. The conversation unfolded exactly as Avery had expected. Language about boundaries, about transparency, about protecting everyone involved. Phrases that sounded reasonable when removed from context and predatory when assembled together. Avery listened without interrupting, her face neutral, her breathing slow. She noticed how carefully the questions were framed, how each one implied a conclusion without stating it outright. She noticed how responsibility was being positioned, gently but persistently, toward her. It was a trial without a charge. Avery realized then that the purpose of the meeting was not resolution. It was documentation, a paper trail, a way to signal to the rest of the organization that something improper had occurred and that the company had addressed it. And because power rarely indicted itself, the solution required a subject small enough to absorb the blame without disrupting the structure. In the past, Avery would have shrunk. She would have explained. She would have tried to sound reasonable, cooperative, harmless. She would have filled the silence with reassurance, even if it meant accepting fault she had not earned. That version of her understood survival as accommodation. This time, something different happened. She spoke only when necessary. Her answers were concise, factual, stripped of emotion. She did not embellish. She did not volunteer. She did not attempt to soften the room. She acknowledged procedures without internalizing shame. She described her work without framing it as gratitude. She did not deny attention, but she refused to frame it as misconduct. Her stillness unsettled the room. Avery felt it in the slight shifts across the table, in the way one HR representative glanced toward Catherine before continuing. Silence, when held deliberately, had weight. It forced others to supply meaning themselves, and people in positions of authority were unused to doing that without control. Catherine watched closely. Avery could sense her attention like a presence just behind her shoulder. Catherine had expected nerves. She had expected fear. She had expected the subtle collapse that made people easier to manage. Instead, she was witnessing something less predictable. A woman who was not fighting, not pleading, and not performing remorse. That was dangerous. The questions continued, circling closer to implication. Avery answered them with the same measured calm. She did not defend Rowan Cross. She did not accuse him either. She spoke as if the system itself were the only thing in the room, and she were simply a component responding to inputs. The trap became clear. This was not about what had happened. It was about what could be said to have happened. About how easily a narrative could be shaped when one party held power and the other held visibility without protection. Avery saw how the room was arranged to isolate her, how the lighting erased softness, how the absence of windows made time feel suspended. This was not a conversation meant to end with clarity. It was meant to end with her consent. She did not give it. When the meeting paused, the silence stretched longer than etiquette required. Avery remained still, her gaze level, her body language composed. She felt the familiar urge to fill the space rise in her chest, and she let it pass. The room seemed to lean forward, waiting for her to fracture. She did not. That was when the door opened. The sound was quiet, but it cut through the tension with surgical precision. Avery did not turn immediately. She did not need to. The shift in the room announced itself before the figure did. Posture changed. Attention realigned. Authority recalibrated. Rowan Cross entered without hesitation. He did not apologize for interrupting. He did not ask permission. He did not look surprised to find Catherine Monroe there. He stepped into the room as if it belonged to him, because in every way that mattered, it did. His presence altered the balance instantly, not through volume or aggression, but through certainty. Avery felt it like a pressure release, and a tightening at the same time. Rowan did not take the seat at the head of the table. He pulled out the chair beside Avery and sat down, placing himself unmistakably within her space. The gesture was simple, controlled, and devastating. It made visible what the room had been trying to obscure. It made clear that whatever narrative was being constructed would not proceed without his participation. The effect was immediate. Catherine's composure tightened, just slightly. One of the HR representatives straightened, hands folding together with sudden precision. The power dynamic shifted not because Rowan raised his voice, but because he did not need to. He had entered as the final authority in the room, and everyone knew it. Rowan acknowledged the situation with calm efficiency. He did not dramatize. He did not frame himself as protector or savior. He spoke as someone clarifying facts that should never have required clarification. His attention moved briefly to Avery, not in reassurance, but in recognition. He did not look at her as a liability. He looked at her as an asset that had been miscategorized. He dismantled the premise of the meeting, without theatrics. Avery felt the weight lift from her chest in increments, not relief exactly, but validation. Not of emotion, but of position. Rowan did not argue that nothing inappropriate had occurred. He made a different claim, one far more destabilizing. He asserted that Avery's work had been professional, that her involvement had been based on competence, and that any assumptions beyond that were products of speculation rather than evidence. He relocated the problem. No longer Avery, no longer proximity, no longer attention. The problem became the system that allowed rumor to masquerade as concern and scrutiny, to disguise itself as protection. It was a quiet accusation, and it landed harder than any raised voice could have. Catherine did not interrupt. She could not without revealing herself. The HR representatives adjusted their posture again, recalibrating their approach in real time. The record they had been building began to fracture, its logic undermined by the one person whose authority could not be overridden. Avery remained silent. That, too, was a choice. She did not look at Rowan while he spoke. She did not need to. His presence beside her was statement enough. The room now understood that she was not alone in this story, and that changed everything. It did not erase risk. It transformed it. By the time the meeting concluded, nothing had been resolved on paper. That was the point. There was no disciplinary action, no formal warning, no documented fault. On the surface, it appeared as though the conversation had simply clarified boundaries and expectations. But beneath that veneer, something fundamental had shifted. Avery and Rowan had crossed an invisible line together. Not a romantic one, not yet. A structural one. They had disrupted the quiet agreement that allowed systems like this to function. That power protected itself, that visibility was punished, that individuals were interchangeable. Rowan had refused to let Avery be used as a corrective example. In doing so, He had exposed the machinery that relied on such examples to operate smoothly. Avery felt the consequences before she could name them. As she left the room, she sensed the recalculation happening around her. Catherine's gaze followed her with a new intensity, no longer masked by polite concern. The HR representatives avoided her eyes. The corridor felt colder, narrower, as if the building itself had taken note. Rowan walked beside her only part of the way, then peeled off without ceremony, returning to his domain. He did not explain himself. He did not offer comfort. He did not promise safety. He did not need to. His intervention had not been an ending. It had been an ignition. Avery returned to her desk with the steady awareness that the rules governing her existence in this place had changed. She had not been erased. She had not been punished. She had not been rescued. She had been chosen as a line that would not be crossed quietly. The office looked the same. The noise resumed. Screens glowed. People typed. But beneath the surface, something had fractured. A narrative had been interrupted. A hierarchy had been challenged. Avery understood, with a clarity that settled deep in her bones, that the price for this moment would not be immediate. Systems did not retaliate loudly. They waited. And as she sat down, placing her hands on her desk, feeling the familiar steadiness of her own posture, Avery knew that whatever came next would not be an accident. The trap had been public. The consequences would be structural. And nothing about this story would be simple again. Rowan Cross did not vanish all at once. At first, his absence looked like efficiency. Meetings were rescheduled with polite explanations. Decisions arrived by proxy, filtered through assistants and interim signatures. His name still appeared on documents, still anchored authority, still reassured investors and executives alike. To anyone watching casually, it seemed like nothing more than the natural compression of a man whose influence no longer required constant visibility. Avery noticed the change before it was named. She noticed it in the way requests slowed, then stopped. In the way her calendar began to thin, meetings quietly reassigned to others without explanation. She noticed it in the silence of her inbox, where Rowan's direct instructions had once arrived without ceremony and now did not arrive at all. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself this was what normalization looked like after disruption. The building told a different story. Executives moved differently, shoulders tighter, conversations shorter. Assistants avoided unnecessary eye contact. Doors closed more often than they used to and stayed closed longer. It was the behavior of an organization correcting itself, not loudly, not visibly, but with surgical intent. Avery recognized the pattern with a familiar, sinking clarity. She had seen versions of this before, smaller, quieter, enacted on people with less power than Rowan Cross. Power was being redistributed. The official announcement arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, buried beneath routine updates and quarterly forecasts. The language was immaculate, polished by lawyers and communications teams who understood the importance of calm phrasing. Temporary restructuring, strategic alignment, board-level oversight. Rowan Cross would be stepping back from day-to-day operations to allow the company to focus on long-term objectives. Nothing in the message accused him of wrongdoing. Nothing defended him either. The truth lived in the space between those omissions. Avery read the email once, then again, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of her desk. Around her, the office reacted with practiced restraint. No gasps, no questions, just the subtle shift of attention, the recalibration of alliances. People forwarded the announcement with neutral commentary, as if sharing weather updates rather than the quiet removal of the company's axis. Rowan Cross had been taken out of sight. Not erased, not disgraced. Contained. The effect was immediate. His office lights went dark. The executive hallway grew quieter, emptier, its gravity weakened. Decisions that once moved with speed now stalled in committees. Authority fractured into layers, each one safer, blander, less accountable. The company exhaled, relieved by the return of predictability, even as something essential drained from its core. Avery felt the second consequence unfold, almost simultaneously. Her access changed without notice. Documents she had once edited now appeared read-only. Invitations vanished. Projects she had been embedded in moved forward without her name attached. When she reached out for clarification, responses arrived late, vague, or not at all. It was not punitive enough to provoke outrage. It was subtle enough to be denied. Her erasure had begun. She continued to come to work every morning, her routine unchanged. Badge, elevator, desk. She dressed the same, spoke the same, worked the same. But the building no longer responded to her presence the way it had weeks earlier. People passed her desk without lingering. Conversations cut off when she approached, not abruptly, but gently, like hands smoothing wrinkles from fabric. She was no longer interesting. That frightened her more than hostility ever had. The porcelain teacup remained on her desk, its thin crack catching the light at certain angles. It had once anchored her. Now it felt exposed. She noticed eyes flick toward it more often than before, assessing, remembering. The object that had been invisible when she was invisible had become evidence when she was not. She considered taking it home, wrapping it in cloth, hiding it away until this passed. She did not. Something inside her resisted the impulse to retreat. She had already seen what hiding cost. It did not guarantee safety. It only delayed attention until it arrived with sharper teeth. The office felt like a theater after the final curtain. People performed normalcy with exaggerated care. Laughter sounded rehearsed. Productivity was weaponized, used to avoid reflection. No one spoke Rowan's name unless necessary. When they did, it was with a neutrality so forced it bordered on reverence. History was being rewritten in real time, his presence reduced to a footnote that no one lingered on. Avery moved through this space like a ghost that had not yet realized it was dead. Her work still mattered in theory. In practice, it was being starved. She completed assignments that led nowhere, revised documents that never left her queue. She was included just enough to remain accountable, excluded just enough to remain powerless. It was an elegant cruelty, refined through years of organizational instinct. She understood what was happening. The company was not punishing her. It was waiting her out. By removing Rowan from visibility, they had removed her shield without ever acknowledging it as such. Without his gravitational pull, her proximity to power meant nothing. Worse, it meant risk. She had been a variable introduced into a system that prized stability above all else. Now the system was correcting. She felt it in the way Catherine Monroe no longer spoke to her at all. There were no warnings, no smiles, no guidance. Catherine's attention had shifted elsewhere, satisfied. That absence was confirmation enough. The narrative had been secured, the disruption contained. The remaining inconvenience would resolve itself in time. Avery's body reacted before her mind allowed the fear to surface. Her sleep fractured. Her shoulders stayed tense long after she left the building. She replayed moments she could not change, words she had never spoken. The sense of being watched receded, replaced by something colder. Being ignored. She recognized this stage intimately. It was the long game of institutions. Make the subject doubt their own relevance. Let them exhaust themselves seeking clarity that would never arrive. Eventually, they would leave on their own, grateful for escape, relieved to disappear. The building had done this before. It would do it again. One evening, as the office emptied earlier than usual, Avery remained at her desk, staring at a document she had edited 3 times without purpose. The lights dimmed incrementally, programmed to conserve energy, to encourage departure. She felt the quiet settle around her, thick and heavy. She reached for her teacup. The porcelain was cool now, the tea long finished. She turned it slowly in her hands, tracing the crack with her thumb. The imperfection no longer felt fragile. It felt defiant, proof of survival rather than damage. She realized then that this was the moment the story demanded something from her. Not action, not rebellion, not noise. Endurance. The system wanted her to collapse inward, to apologize herself into invisibility, to become unremarkable again. It wanted her to doubt the reality she had experienced, to believe that Rowan's intervention had been an anomaly, a mistake that needed correcting. She could comply. She could return to the quiet corner of the building where nothing touched her and nothing asked anything of her. She could remove the cup, soften her presence, fade. Or she could remain exactly where she was. Present, unfolded, unashamed. The choice was not heroic. It was lonely. Avery packed her bag and left the building without haste, stepping into the city's evening noise with a strange sense of detachment. The skyline glittered indifferently above her, full of other stories unfolding in parallel. Somewhere, Rowan Cross existed beyond the company's glass walls, his absence both deliberate and enforced. She did not know what his disappearance meant for him. She knew exactly what it meant for her. This was the darkest stretch not because of fear, but because of clarity. The illusion that the system might protect what was valuable had been stripped away. Value, she understood now, was conditional. It could be reassigned, redefined, erased. Unless it was claimed. The next morning, Avery returned to her desk as she always did. She placed the teacup on its corner, unhidden. She opened her inbox, empty as expected. She began her work without asking permission. She did not know what would come next. She only knew that disappearing again would cost her more than staying visible ever had. And somewhere in the quiet recalibration of the building, that refusal registered, subtle and unwelcome, like a flaw in a system that believed itself flawless. The sign arrived when Avery Knight had stopped expecting anything to arrive at all. By then, days had settled into a muted rhythm defined by absence. Her inbox remained thin, her calendar bare, her presence tolerated but no longer required. The company had perfected the art of quiet removal, and Avery felt herself living inside its margins, present enough to be accountable, invisible enough to be expendable. She no longer looked for Rowan Cross's name in announcements or schedules. She no longer anticipated disruption. Anticipation was a luxury for people who still believed events followed logic. That was why the moment caught her unprepared. It happened late in the afternoon, when the building thinned out and the noise softened into a hollow echo. Avery had stayed later than usual, not out of dedication, but inertia. Leaving earlier felt like admitting something had ended. She shut down her computer and gathered her things with deliberate calm, moving slowly, aware of the way the office felt after hours. The lights dimmed automatically in unused sections, and the air carried that particular stillness that followed productivity, like a stage after the audience had left. She passed the executive hallway without intention, her steps guided by habit rather than purpose. The corridor had been largely abandoned since Rowan's disappearance, its doors closed, its presence diminished. Avery did not usually walk this way anymore. There was no reason to. And yet, something drew her forward, a subtle tension she could not name. One of the doors stood ajar. It was not Rowan's office, but an adjacent room rarely used now, a private conference space that had once hosted high-level discussions and now sat idle. The light inside was low, the room quiet. Avery slowed, uncertainty tightening in her chest. She was not scheduled to be there. She had no authorization she could point to if questioned. Every instinct told her to keep walking, to avoid spaces where she could be accused of trespass simply by existing. She hesitated. Then she noticed the box. It sat in the center of the conference table, perfectly placed, its presence unmistakable. Rectangular, matte black, no logos, no delivery label, no name. It looked intentional in a way that made her pulse quicken. This was not something left behind by accident. This was not corporate property. This was a message. Avery stepped inside and closed the door gently behind her, more out of instinct than secrecy. The room absorbed the sound. The silence deepened. She stood still for several seconds, listening for footsteps in the hallway, for any sign that she was being watched. Nothing stirred. She approached the table slowly. Up close, the box revealed itself further. Heavy cardstock, clean edges, tied with a thin, dark ribbon knotted with care rather than haste. It was elegant without being ornate, restrained in the way only someone accustomed to power would choose restraint. Avery's hands hovered above it, uncertainty flickering through her. Opening it felt like crossing another boundary, one she could not easily retreat from. She untied the ribbon. The lid lifted without resistance. Inside, nestled in pale linen, lay a porcelain teacup. Avery's breath caught. It was unmistakably the same design as the one she brought to work every day. The same soft curve, the same delicate handle, the same faded rose painted along the side. But where her cup bore a thin crack near the rim, this one was flawless. Smooth, unbroken, whole. For a moment, she could not touch it. The resemblance was too precise to be coincidence. This was not a generic replacement. This was a deliberate recreation. Someone had noticed the details, the imperfections, the quiet significance of an object Avery had believed invisible to everyone else. Her throat tightened as the implications settled over her. Beneath the cup lay a folded letter. No envelope, no seal, just thick, cream-colored paper, the kind chosen for permanence rather than convenience. Avery lifted it carefully, as if afraid the meaning might fracture under pressure. Her fingers trembled despite her effort to keep them steady. She unfolded the page slowly, giving herself time to prepare for what it might contain. The letter did not begin with apology. It did not offer explanation or defense. It did not ask for forgiveness or understanding. Instead, it revealed a truth that reconfigured everything Avery thought she knew. Rowan Cross had noticed her long before the message. Not in the way executives noticed employees, not as a name on a report or a figure in an organizational chart. He had noticed her quiet competence, her restraint, the way she moved through the building without demanding space. He had noticed her consistency, her refusal to perform, her habit of holding still when others filled silence with noise. He had noticed the porcelain cup, not as an eccentricity, but as a signal, a softness that persisted in an environment designed to grind such things down. Avery read the words once, then again, the meaning sinking deeper with each pass. Rowan did not romanticize what he saw. He did not frame her as exceptional or rare. He described her as someone who had learned to survive without erasing herself completely, someone who carried something fragile into hostile territory and refused to be ashamed of it. He acknowledged, with unsettling clarity, that his position had made him complicit in a system that punished that kind of endurance, that his authority had benefited from silence like hers, even as it threatened to consume it. The letter explained his disappearance without justifying it. He wrote that stepping back had not been an act of cowardice or retreat, but a choice made under constraint. That the attention surrounding her had grown dangerous, not because of what she had done, but because of what the system required to protect itself. He had recognized the pattern too late to stop it entirely, but early enough to redirect its force away from her public destruction. Avery felt the weight of that admission settle in her chest. This was not a confession meant to absolve him. It was an acknowledgement of harm without the expectation of forgiveness. It did not ask her to understand his pain or validate his sacrifice. It simply laid out the truth as he saw it, stripped of performance. The care embedded in the letter cut deeper than any declaration could have. There was no promise of return, no hint of reconciliation, no suggestion that this gift demanded response. The porcelain cup was not presented as a replacement for the one she carried, but as a mirror, a reminder. Rowan wrote that the crack in her cup had never signified damage to him. It had signified survival, that the absence of a crack did not mean superiority, only difference. Avery lowered the letter to the table and stared at the cup again. She thought of the mornings she had carried her own cup into the office, wrapped carefully, aware of how out of place it looked. She thought of the way she had once considered hiding it, removing it, protecting herself by eliminating anything that made her visible. She thought of how easily the system had attempted to turn that softness into evidence against her. Now she held proof that someone had seen it differently. The realization unsettled her more than comforted her. Avery reached for the cup at last, lifting it from the linen. It was cool and smooth beneath her fingers, its weight familiar despite its perfection. She turned it slowly, searching for a flaw that did not exist. The absence of the crack felt strange, almost disorienting. This version of the object did not carry history. It had not survived being dropped. It had not been held through sleepless nights or hospital corridors. It was beautiful, and it was incomplete. She placed it gently beside the letter and sat back, pressing her palms flat against the table. The room felt smaller now, as if the truth had taken up space. Avery closed her eyes briefly, allowing the tension she had been holding for weeks to surface at last. Her chest tightened, not with grief exactly, but with release. For the first time since Rowan's disappearance, she allowed herself to feel the full complexity of what had happened. She had not imagined his attention. She had not exaggerated the risk. She had not been wrong to feel exposed, endangered, changed. The system had responded exactly as systems did when their balance was disturbed. Rowan's intervention had not saved her from consequence, but it had altered the shape of it. And now, in this quiet room, she held evidence that she had not been alone in understanding what was at stake. The letter did not ask her to choose him. It asked her to choose herself. Avery gathered the items slowly, folding the letter with care, returning it to the box. She placed the perfect cup beside it and closed the lid, retying the ribbon with the same deliberate precision she brought to everything she valued. For a moment, she rested her hands on top of the box, grounding herself in the reality of its weight. Then she picked it up. Leaving the room felt different than entering it. The hallway no longer seemed empty. The building no longer felt indifferent. Avery moved through it with a heightened awareness of her own presence, not smaller, not louder, simply more defined. She carried the box close to her body, not hiding it, not displaying it, but holding it as something that belonged to her. At her desk, she set the box down carefully and retrieved her own teacup from its cloth wrap. She placed the two cups side by side, the cracked and the whole, identical and irrevocably different. She studied them for a long moment, understanding settling into her with quiet force. Wholeness was not the absence of damage. It was the refusal to be ashamed of it. Avery wrapped the new cup and the letter together and placed them in her bag, leaving her original cup where it had always been. She did not replace it. She did not hide it. She poured herself fresh tea, added honey, and took a slow sip. The taste grounded her. She finished her work and shut down her computer without haste. When she stood, her posture felt unchanged, but something inside her had realigned. The system could erase names, restrict access, and rewrite narratives. It could isolate and exhaust and wait. What it could not do was define her value without her consent. As Avery left the building that evening, the city greeted her with its usual indifference. Lights flickered on in towers above her. Traffic moved. People passed without noticing. Somewhere beyond the reach of corporate corridors, Rowan Cross existed as a man rather than a position. She did not know if she would ever see him again. She knew, with certainty, that the gift he had left her would not fade into sentiment. It had sharpened her understanding. And that cut would never fully heal, because it was not meant to. It was meant to remind her that being seen was dangerous, but being erased was worse, and that softness, once acknowledged, could never be convincingly denied again. The change did not arrive as a single moment. It arrived as a series of quiet refusals. Avery Knight stopped anticipating judgment before it had time to form. She no longer adjusted her pace in the corridors when footsteps approached from behind. She no longer softened her presence to make others comfortable. She placed her porcelain cup openly on her desk each morning, no longer wrapped in apology, no longer positioned as an accident waiting to happen. The crack along its rim caught the light without embarrassment, a thin, unhidden line that marked survival rather than damage. This shift was subtle enough that no announcement accompanied it, but profound enough that the office felt it immediately. People recalibrated around her without nomming what had changed. Conversations resumed in her presence without dropping into silence. Glances lingered and then moved on. The building, which had once tried to wait her out, now treated her as something stable rather than temporary. She did not reclaim power through force or ambition. She claimed it through refusal to disappear. The organization itself began to settle back into patterns it understood. Catherine Monroe's influence receded quietly, reframed as a strategic relocation rather than a removal. The official explanation praised her adaptability and experience, while relocating her far enough from the center that her attention no longer shaped the narrative. The board appointed a new executive leader whose greatest strength was predictability. Stability returned as a corporate virtue, celebrated and reinforced. The machinery repaired itself with practiced efficiency. Avery watched these changes unfold without inserting herself into them. She remained where she was, not advancing, not retreating. Her work regained purpose as her involvement stabilized. Projects returned to her desk not because of proximity to power, but because she delivered results without spectacle. The system learned, slowly and reluctantly, that she was not an anomaly to be corrected, but a constant it would have to accommodate. The absence that lingered most was Rowan Cross. His name no longer circulated in internal communications. His influence had dissolved into abstraction, referenced only when necessary and always in the past tense. Avery did not seek updates. She did not search for traces. Whatever existed between them had been suspended in a space that did not belong to the company, and she understood that revisiting it prematurely would collapse the balance she had built. Time passed differently after that. Weeks unfolded without escalation. The tension that had once sharpened every interaction softened into something quieter, less volatile. Avery slept more deeply. Her body unlearned the constant vigilance it had carried for years. She recognized this not as relief, but as adjustment, the slow recalibration of someone who no longer expected to be punished for existing. When the invitation came, it did not arrive through corporate channels. It appeared on her phone late one evening, unbranded and direct, a location rather than a request. No expectations attached, no context provided. Avery did not respond immediately. She read it once, then set the phone down, allowing herself the rare luxury of choice without urgency. She agreed only after she recognized that the decision no longer frightened her. The place was deliberately unremarkable. A quiet cafe tucked between older buildings, ivy-climbing brick walls, tables that did not match. The kind of place where time slowed rather than performed. There were no glass walls, no security badges, no hierarchy embedded in architecture. Power did not announce itself here. Avery arrived alone. She carried both porcelain cups with her, wrapped carefully, the weight of them steady against her side. The cracked one she had always carried. The unbroken one she had received and never used. Together, they felt less like opposites than companions, two truths that refused to cancel each other out. Rowan Cross was already there. Without the architecture of authority surrounding him, he looked different. Not diminished, but stripped of the symbols that had once made him untouchable. He occupied space with the same controlled stillness, but the absence of title altered the atmosphere. He was present rather than imposed. Avery took her seat across from him, without hesitation. For a moment, neither of them moved. The quiet between them was not tense. It was full, layered with what had already been acknowledged without words. Avery noticed that her hands were steady as she unwrapped the cups and placed them on the table between them. The cracked porcelain and the flawless replica rested side by side, identical in shape and radically different in history. The gesture spoke without speech. It made visible the choice Avery had already made. She did not frame what followed as confession or explanation. She did not soften it with humor or caution. She did not offer it as an accident, a reaction, or a response to pressure. She expressed, with clarity and control, that the feeling which had once escaped her unintentionally now belonged to her fully. It was not rooted in imbalance or rescue. It was grounded in recognition. She had been seen, and she had not been asked to become someone else in return. The act of claiming that truth on her own terms altered its meaning entirely. What had once been dangerous because it was unsolicited now carried no threat. It did not seek permission. It did not ask for protection. It simply existed, intact. Rowan received it without interruption. There was no triumph in his response, no sense of victory. What passed between them was quieter than that, anchored in restraint rather than escalation. He did not attempt to define what came next. He did not reassert control. He remained present, allowing the moment to be what it was rather than forcing it toward resolution. That restraint mattered. It affirmed that whatever connection remained between them was no longer bound to the system that had first made it dangerous. It existed outside of hierarchy, outside of spectacle, outside of consequence that did not belong to them. They spent the remainder of the evening in stillness rather than performance. Time passed without being measured. The cups remained untouched, symbolic rather than functional. When Avery eventually lifted the cracked one and drank from it, the choice felt deliberate rather than habitual. She did not replace it with the unbroken cup. She did not reject it either. Both belonged to her now. When they parted, there was no urgency to define the future. Avery walked back into the city alone, carrying both cups as she always had, wrapped carefully, balanced against her body. The night air was cool, the streets alive with movement that had nothing to do with her story. She felt no need to rush, no need to replay the moment, no need to brace for impact. The next morning, the office received her as it always did. She placed her original cup on her desk, unhidden. She opened her inbox, full enough to matter. She resumed her work without commentary. No one asked questions. No one needed answers. The system had adjusted to her presence as a constant rather than a variable. Later that day, she added the unbroken cup to her bag and brought it home. It did not replace the cracked one. It did not sit on her desk. It waited, clean and whole, a reminder rather than a standard. Avery understood now that perfection was not something to aspire to. It was something to recognize as optional. What remained was choice. The story did not end with victory over the corporation or escape from its reach. It ended with Avery no longer orienting herself around its gaze. She had not been saved. She had not been elevated. She had been altered in a way that could not be undone. She had chosen to be visible. And she had done so without sacrificing herself in the process. That was the quiet power at the center of everything that followed. Story written and directed for Dark Hearts Collection. Thank you for being part of this silence between storms. More stories soon.